Pilot refuses to believe black woman is a licensed engineer. His career ends in an emergency landing. Her name was Ebony King, a brilliant aerospace engineer whose talents had revolutionized complex aircraft designs. Yet on a fateful flight aboard a Boeing 737, none of that would matter to a pilot named Captain Leland Parker. To him, she was nothing more than a boastful passenger, spouting impossible credentials. When the engines roared and panic struck at 30,000 feet, Ebony would be the only one capable of saving everyone on board. But would anyone trust her before it was too late? This is the story of disbelief, danger, and the ultimate reckoning that would change their lives forever. Ebony King clutched her worn, faux leather laptop bag as she made her way through John F. Kennedy International Airport. She had a distinct kind of confidence about her, quiet, commanding, and fueled by years of having to prove herself in boardrooms, factory floors, and even family gatherings where nobody seemed to understand the depth of her expertise in aerospace engineering. She was on her way to San Francisco for a technical consultation on a cutting-edge propulsion system. But to Ebony, this flight was just another in a long series of cross-country trips. She had no idea that everything she'd built her life around her expertise, her self-worth, and her unwavering belief in science would be tested at 30,000 feet. Ebony was used to stairs. A slender black woman with elegantly styled curls, dressed in business attire, carrying a laptop bag covered in stickers that proclaimed, "Women in STEM, I heart NASA, and engineering is for everyone." She'd look out at the sea of travelers, noticing the curiosity in some eyes, the dismissiveness in others. That morning was no different, and the slight tension that often followed her was present in the air. But Ebony did what she always did. She took a deep breath, adjusted her bag, and headed for Gate 32B, which displayed the big letters, Flight 572 to San Francisco. The gate area was crowded as usual. Business people stood glued to their phones. Families wrangled children who squirmed in restless anticipation. Ebony took a seat near the boarding counter, focusing on an upcoming project on her tablet. She was so absorbed she barely noticed when a tall man in a pilot's uniform approached the gate desk. He had sharp features and a meticulously neat uniform. His ID lanyard read, in bold letters, Captain Leland Parker. Though he carried a professional air, his conversation with the gate agent had an irritable edge. "Any updates on the departure time, Sarah?" he asked the gate agent in a curt tone. Sarah responded politely, "Right on time, Captain Parker." He nodded, but seemed to find something unsatisfactory about the situation, scrutinizing the passenger list on a monitor and letting out a quiet sigh. The tension in him was palpable. Ebony, glancing up from her tablet, caught a fleeting glimpse of the man's face, which looked both tired and vaguely aggravated. Their eyes met. Parker gave a barely perceptible nod in Ebony's direction, then quickly turned away. Something about that look, Ebony would later recall, felt strange. But for the moment, she shrugged it off, attributing his demeanor to the usual stress of commercial aviation. If only it had ended there. A voice on the intercom announced the start of boarding for first class and premium travelers. Ebony stood, feeling her phone vibrate. A text message from her mother, wishing her a safe flight and reminding her that the world was wide open for an engineer of her caliber. Ebony smiled. She was proud of how far she'd come. This was someone who had grown up in a modest neighborhood, faced all sorts of systemic obstacles, and yet here she was, an in-demand aerospace engineer whom top companies consulted for specialized designs. She boarded the Boeing 737, heading for her aisle seat in business class. Tucking her bag overhead, she felt a wave of excitement about the upcoming project. She had spent years on research teams designing advanced aeronautical systems. While Ebony no longer worked for NASA, her initial dream job, she was still intimately involved in aerospace innovations, from propulsion systems to cutting-edge materials. Her knowledge was deep, and her credentials were impeccable. The interior of the aircraft buzzed with the usual boarding chaos. Flight attendants guided passengers. Overhead bins slammed, seat belts clicked. Ebony settled in with a sigh, thinking about the joys of a window seat. She hoped to catch glimpses of cloud formations, a habit she never outgrew. As she scrolled her tablet, reviewing engineering diagrams for her upcoming project, she hardly noticed Captain Parker's voice crackling through the PAR system. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your Captain Leland Parker, welcoming you aboard Flight 572. We're looking at clear skies ahead to San Francisco. Expected flight time is approximately 6 hours and 10 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride." She didn't think much of it until he added, almost impatiently, "And please comply with our cabin crew for any instructions." The line felt strange, laced with an emphasis that Ebony couldn't quite place. She brushed it off again. Her mind was busy with her upcoming design review. Her team was proposing a brand new approach to engine mounting that could reduce fuel consumption and improve reliability. She couldn't wait to unveil her final modifications in the meeting. Little did she know, before that flight reached its destination, her knowledge and expertise would be called upon in the most unexpected way imaginable. 30 minutes after takeoff, Ebony was just beginning to doze off when she felt a faint rumble beneath her feet. It felt heavier than usual turbulence, more like a vibration from deep within the aircraft. She glanced around. Most passengers seemed unfazed, many lost in movies or conversation. Flight 572 maintained its altitude, and even the flight attendants looked calm. Yet Ebony's trained ear caught a subtle pitch in the engine's hum, something she had come to recognize in her years working on experimental aircraft. She made a mental note to keep an eye, or rather, an ear on that unusual sound. A few minutes later, the seatbelt sign dinged on. Ebony's seat neighbor, a well-dressed older man, glanced at her with mild concern. An announcement soon followed. "Ladies and gentlemen," a flight attendant's voice echoed through the cabin. "The captain has turned on the seatbelt sign due to a brief patch of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened." The plane rocked gently. Ebony peered out the window and saw clear skies with only a few scattered clouds. Her instincts told her something else was causing this vibration. She reminded herself that false alarms happened all the time. Airplanes were designed to handle much worse. This was likely just a pocket of irregular air or a small mechanical quirk, nothing to panic about. Still, Ebony had that nagging intuition. She was intimately familiar with how a Boeing 737 should sound under normal cruising conditions. Could it be an anomaly in the hydraulic system, an imbalance in the rotor spool? She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but she also knew ignoring potential issues could be dangerous. When the aircraft finally stabilized, Ebony decided to share her concerns. She pressed the call button. A flight attendant, an affable woman named Teresa, approached. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" Ebony tried to keep her tone light. "Everything's okay, right? I just noticed a strange vibration about 10 minutes ago," and Teresa's expression remained friendly but guarded. "We were expecting some mild turbulence in this region. The captain says everything's fine." Ebony nodded, her mind racing. "Sure, it's probably nothing. But I'm an aerospace engineer. I've worked on aircraft systems, including the 737's design. It might be worth having the flight deck know that a passenger with a technical background noticed something unusual." Teresa blinked, obviously unsure how to respond. "You're an engineer?" "Yes, licensed and specialized in aircraft propulsion. I'm not trying to cause alarm." Just, better safe than sorry. Teresa's polite smile wavered. I appreciate your concern, ma'am. I'll relay your message to the cockpit. She left, but Ebony sensed a hint of skepticism in her voice, one she had encountered more times than she could count. About 20 minutes later, Teresa returned, looking a bit uncomfortable. "Ma'am, the captain says everything's under control." He said, "Tell the passenger we are trained professionals and we have instruments monitoring everything." Ebony swallowed her frustration. "Of course," she said, forcing a cordial smile. "Thank you for checking." She tried to let it go. Perhaps she was overthinking. Flying was safer than driving, they always said. If the pilot dismissed her observation, maybe it truly was nothing. But Ebony couldn't fully relax. She slipped on her noise-cancelling headphones and pretended to watch an in-flight movie, though her thoughts remained locked on that odd tremor. She scribbled a few notes in her tablet about the approximate time, altitude and conditions. Old habits died hard. Ebony always recorded anomalies for future analysis. This was more reflex than actual alarm. An hour later, the flight attendants began beverage service. Ebony sipped ginger ale, still replaying that subtle vibration in her mind. Her neighbor introduced himself as Daniel, a real estate consultant traveling for business. He noticed Ebony's pensive mood and asked if she was all right. She gave a non-committal response about some work on her mind, but she stopped short of mentioning the vibrations again. She didn't want to stir the pot. If Ebony had known what was about to happen next, she might have pressed harder for answers. Instead, she let the tension simmer beneath the surface, focusing on her upcoming meeting and ignoring that small voice of doubt that said she should insist on being heard. The flight seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. Passengers chatted, flight attendants navigated the aisles with carts of drinks and snacks, and Ebony tried to push her concerns away. The faint rattle didn't reoccur, which only made her question whether she'd imagined it. Then came the moment that changed everything, a call over the intercom requesting that a flight attendant come to the cockpit. Teresa, who had seemed so skeptical earlier, hurried past Ebony with a furrowed brow. The flight deck door opened momentarily, letting Ebony catch a quick glimpse of the pilot and co-pilot in deep discussion, their expressions tense. The door shut, and Ebony could practically feel her pulse in her temples. Something was wrong. She could sense it like an electric charge in the cabin air. Minutes later, Teresa emerged, scanning the rows until her eyes landed on Ebony. She walked over with an apprehensive air. "Ma'am, could you please come with me?" Teresa said softly, leaning in so that nearby passengers wouldn't overhear. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Ebony: curiosity, nervousness, but also a glimmer of hope that perhaps the flight crew was taking her concerns seriously. She unbuckled her seatbelt, ignoring the questioning look from Daniel, who frowned as she got up. Teresa escorted Ebony to the front of the plane, past the drawn curtain that separated first class from business class. They paused near the cockpit door. "The captain wants to speak with you," Teresa said, her tone noticeably guarded. She pressed a button near the door, and after a moment, the lock clicked. The door swung open to reveal the cramped cockpit. Captain Parker was seated in the left seat, a stern look on his face. The first officer, a young man with tired eyes, turned slightly to glance at Ebony. Teresa gestured for Ebony to step inside. In all her travels, Ebony had never been summoned to the cockpit like this. She felt her heart pounding as she assessed the environment. The overhead panels glowed with green and amber lights. The instrument screens flickered with flight data. One glance at the throttle quadrant told Ebony they were still cruising at a steady speed. But the tension in the room was palpable. Captain Parker swiveled in his seat, removing his headset. His voice carried an air of condescension. "You're the passenger who claims to be an aerospace engineer, correct?" Ebony forced a polite nod. "Yes, sir. Ebony King. I work primarily in propulsion systems." He cut her off. "Right. Well, There's an indicator issue with one of the engine sensors, and I hear you've been alerting the flight attendants about vibrations. It was just a concern, Ebony said, struggling to keep her tone neutral. I picked up on something abnormal earlier. Could be a hydraulic or engine mount issue, or maybe a sensor glitch. But I thought, Captain Parker sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes at the co-pilot. These planes are tested and maintained meticulously. We have checklists, advanced instrumentation, years of training. And now I'm dealing with a jittery passenger who thinks she's found the next big problem. Ebony felt a flush of anger rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. I am not trying to tell you how to do your job, Captain. I just felt it was necessary to bring an anomaly to your attention. He studied her skeptically, his gaze drifting over her face, then to the name badge on her business suit. Engineers typically have credentials. Where exactly did you study, Miss King? Georgia Tech for undergrad, then MIT for my master's in aerospace engineering, Ebony replied. I've been licensed through the National Society of Professional Engineers for several years. The co-pilot's eyebrows rose. He seemed slightly impressed, but Captain Parker let out a sarcastic chuckle. Well, that's a tidy resume. But I'm not in the habit of taking technical advice from passengers. You see this cockpit? We're fully capable of diagnosing our own instrumentation. Ebony's heart pounded. She wanted to argue, to show him actual data, but she could see the hostility. Maybe the best approach was to stay calm. I understand you have protocols. I just want everyone to be safe. Captain Parker let out a dismissive breath. We're aware of a minor sensor malfunction. The maintenance team in San Francisco will handle it upon landing. It's not urgent. He grabbed a document from a side pocket, flipping through a manual with purposeful aggression. We'll handle it, Miss King. Now, if there's nothing else. Ebony hesitated, feeling the tension in the cramped cockpit. She thought about reminding him that ignoring small anomalies sometimes led to big disasters. But Captain Parker's glare told her the conversation was over. With a last glance at the flickering indicator on the overhead panel, Ebony turned. Teresa ushered her out, closing the cockpit door behind them. As she made her way back to her seat, Ebony felt the sting of humiliation. Passengers stared curiously. They had seen her being summoned to the cockpit. She slipped back into her seat and tried not to meet Daniel's questioning gaze. The pilot's words rang in her ears. I'm not in the habit of taking technical advice from passengers. Yet Ebony King knew airplanes the way artists knew paintbrushes, and something still felt wrong. If she was right, ignoring that feeling could spell disaster. An hour passed. Ebony busied herself drafting an email about her upcoming propulsion design review, hoping to distract herself from the pilot's condescending tone. Occasionally, she'd feel a subtle shudder in the plane's frame, but none as pronounced as before. Then it happened. A sudden jolt coursed through the aircraft, strong enough to knock a few overhead bags loose. Passengers gasped. Flight attendants in the aisle grabbed onto seat backs for support. Ebony's heart soared into her throat. This was definitely not ordinary turbulence. The seatbelt sign pinged on again, accompanied by an uneasy hush that fell over the cabin. Ebony peered out the window to see if there was any weather system they'd entered. The sky was startlingly clear. No dark clouds, no storms. Yet the plane lurched once more, as though something was shaking it from within. Captain Parker's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding much more serious now. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We're experiencing an unexpected mechanical issue. I need everyone to stay seated and follow the crew's instructions. We're working on the problem. The shift in his tone was undeniable. No more condescension or bravado, just a clipped urgency. Ebony felt a surge of adrenaline. Her mind raced through potential causes, sensor failure leading to incorrect engine performance, a problem with the mechanical linkages of the control surfaces. If the captain had recognized a serious issue, time would be of the essence. Flight attendants scrambled, ensuring everyone was in their seats. Ebony tried to catch Teresa's eye, but the flight attendant was too busy. The interior lights dimmed slightly, replaced by a faint hum of emergency-like illumination. The hush among passengers turned to low murmurs of panic. Suddenly, the plane dropped just a short dip, but enough to make everyone's heart pound. Drinks spilled, and Ebony heard a child cry out. She clutched the armrest as the cabin rattled. This wasn't just a sensor glitch. Something was failing, or at least faltering in a critical way. A beep sounded overhead. A flight attendant's voice, shaky, came through the PA. "We have a medical professional on board who's offered to assist. Please, if anyone else can help, ring your call button." That only heightened the sense of alarm. Ebony wondered if someone got hurt during the jolts. Despite the swirl of fear, she focused on the fact that the plane was still operational. The engines were still running. The cabin hadn't lost pressurization, so it wasn't the worst-case scenario. But if they kept losing altitude, or if the pilot lost control, it could escalate fast. Her neighbor, Daniel, was wide-eyed. "Are we going to be okay?" he whispered, looking to Ebony as though she could provide all the answers. She forced a reassuring smile, but she could feel the tremor in her own voice. The plane's still flying, so that's good. They're probably sorting out the issue right now. In truth, Ebony wanted to bolt from her seat, rush to the cockpit, and offer whatever help she could. But from the pilot's attitude earlier, she doubted he'd welcome her input. And barging in unannounced was never an option. Then, over the intercom, Parker's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We'll be making an unscheduled landing at Denver International Airport. Our right engine is experiencing inconsistent thrust, and we need to address this as soon as possible. I repeat, we are diverting to Denver." A wave of anxiety rippled through the cabin. People started talking, questions flew. Ebony felt both relief and dread. Relief that they were planning an emergency landing, always safer to be on the ground than in the air with a malfunction. Dread, because if the engine truly was compromised, landing safely could be dicey. The plane began its descent, and Ebony caught that vibration again, this time more insistent, as if the entire frame were telling them, "We're in trouble." She closed her eyes, mentally racing through the worst-case scenario. One engine out. The plane could still land, but it required skill and calm nerves from the pilot. She remembered the dismissive look on Captain Parker's face. She hoped, for everyone's sake, that beneath that arrogance, he at least had the skill to set them down safely. The plane's descent grew more turbulent. Flight attendants hurried down the aisle, collecting trash and loose items, instructing everyone to power down electronics. The tension was so thick, Ebony could practically taste it. In the background, Ebony picked up bits of conversation, frantic phone calls, whispered prayers, children crying. Her own mind was ablaze with engineering calculations she couldn't shut off. If the right engine's thrust was inconsistent, it could cause yawing. The pilot would need to constantly adjust the rudder to keep the plane stable. If that sensor Ebony noticed earlier was giving false readings, the flight management system might feed incorrect data to the autopilot. This was a real handful, even for the most seasoned flight crew. She heard a shriek from the back of the plane, someone yelling, "We're going down!" and another passenger yelling, "Shut up! You're scaring my kids!" Fear was contagious, threatening to spiral into pandemonium. But Ebony stayed composed, focusing on one certainty: a Boeing 737 could fly with a single engine, provided the pilots knew what they were doing. At about 10,000 feet, the plane shook violently again, like a leaf in a storm. The overhead lights flickered. Ebony gripped her armrest, her knuckles turning white. Daniel beside her was trembling, and Ebony patted his arm reassuringly. She found herself muttering under her breath, come on, keep it together." Then came a crackling announcement from Parker, sounding eerily calm. "Flight attendants, prepare for an emergency landing." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The phrase, emergency landing, was a jolt of cold reality. It stripped away any illusions that this might still be a routine diversion. Oxygen masks dropped automatically, dangling in front of passengers, even though it seemed the pressurization was still normal. Fear overcame logic for many. Ebony heard the rising panic as people fumbled to put on masks. She donned hers automatically, even though she suspected it was more a precaution than a necessity at that altitude. The landscape outside came into view, the vast outskirts of Denver, with the city's skyline in the distance. The plane banked left, trembling the whole time. In the window's corner, Ebony could see the right engine housing. It didn't look visibly damaged, but she noticed an odd shimmer, possibly an oil leak or exhaust inconsistency. Her mind jumped to all sorts of possibilities. If something was leaking, engine failure could be moments away. The plane leveled off, preparing for final approach. Ebony could see the runways of Denver International Airport. The glimmer of runway lights was a welcome sight, but the plane was descending too fast. She clutched her seatbelt, adrenaline surging as the landing gear deployed with a thud. Would Captain Parker trust Ebony's earlier observations now? Did he even care that a licensed aerospace engineer was on board, someone who could provide crucial insight? Or had it simply become too late? A sudden, loud bang reverberated through the fuselage, followed by a metallic scrape. The cabin shook so violently that several overhead panels popped open. Passengers screamed. Ebony felt the plane yaw abruptly to the right, like it was getting jerked by an invisible rope. Captain Parker's voice, taut with urgency, erupted over the PA. "Brace for impact." Suddenly, Ebony and everyone around her hunched forward, guided by flight attendants, shouted instructions, "Heads down! Stay down!" Ebony grabbed the seat in front of her, pressing her forehead to the backrest, heart hammering like a jackhammer. Her mind reeled with the final possibility. Would they crash? Would the pilot manage to keep the plane on the runway? This was the exact nightmare scenario that haunted the industry. Mechanical failure leading to chaos in the final moments of landing. The screech of tires on asphalt tore through the cabin as the plane hit the runway. It was a savage jolt that rattled Ebony's teeth. The left side landed heavily and the right wing dipped precariously. There was a heart-stopping moment when Ebony thought the plane might cartwheel. Instead, it slammed back, leveling with a spine-rattling force. Sparks flew somewhere outside. Passengers cried out. Brakes squealed in an ear-splitting shriek, tires skidding. Ebony smelled the acrid stink of burning rubber. After what felt like an eternity, the plane lurched to a violent stop, nose tilted slightly downward. Overhead compartments had burst open, baggage littered the aisle. Sirens and flashing lights greeted them from the runway. For a long moment, there was only stunned silence. Then the cabin erupted in a cacophony of relief and panic. People sobbed, coughed, scrambled to unbuckle. Ebony slowly sat up, her legs shaky. But the plane was on the ground, intact. They were alive. And, unbeknownst to anyone at that exact second, Captain Leland Parker's career was about to unravel faster than he ever imagined. In the chaotic aftermath, emergency slides deployed, paramedics rushed to help shaken passengers, and firefighters inspected the plane's smoking landing gear. Airport staff ushered everyone into the terminal, while ground crews secured the runway. Denver International's staff handled the emergency with swift efficiency, even though the entire airport buzzed with the news. A Boeing 737 had just made a harrowing emergency landing, nearly veering off the runway. Ebony trembled as she stepped onto the tarmac, refusing assistance from a well-meaning paramedic. She was only mildly bruised, though her nerves were shattered. She wanted to check if Daniel and the others were okay. The passengers huddled together in groups, some hugging, some crying. Media crews already gathered, cameras and microphones at the ready. Sirens blared. A few yards away, Ebony spotted Captain Parker talking to a group of airline officials. His uniform was rumpled, and he looked exhausted, but Ebony noticed that same glimmer of arrogance in his eyes, like he was defending his every action to the suits who had arrived. She didn't want to approach him, not after how he dismissed her. Still, she yearned for answers. What exactly had failed? Soon, Ebony was approached by a representative from the airline, a woman named Linda. She held a clipboard and seemed both flustered and determined. "Ma'am, I understand you had some concerns about the aircraft before the incident. Several people overheard you mention your engineering background." Ebony sighed, hugging her arms around herself against the chilly Denver breeze. "That's correct. I told the flight attendant, Teresa, about vibrations I noticed early on. Then I spoke briefly to Captain Parker when he summoned me to the cockpit." Linda furrowed her brow, scribbling notes. "Could we arrange for you to speak with the National Transportation Safety Board investigators? They'll want to interview key witnesses, especially someone with a technical background who raised an issue prior to the emergency." Ebony nodded, relief washing over her. Finally, a chance to be heard. "Of course, I'm happy to help in any way I can." Within the hour, Ebony found herself in a private lounge area, speaking with two NTSB officials, Alvarez and Chen. They asked pointed questions about what she'd observed, the nature of the vibrations, the approximate timeline, the altitude, the cockpit conversation. Ebony recounted everything honestly, from her initial conversation with Teresa to Captain Parker's dismissive attitude. When she finished, the investigators exchanged a telling glance. Alvarez leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Miss King, we appreciate your cooperation. We have preliminary data suggesting that the right engine sensor feed was erratic. It led to incorrect thrust adjustments, which almost caused the aircraft to lose directional control on landing. One of the pilots cut thrust entirely on the right engine when the reading spiked, but that caused a violent yaw." Chen chimed in. "The pilot had the option to manually override, but from what we understand, there was some confusion in the cockpit about the authenticity of the sensor readings. This confusion may have contributed to the rough landing. Your report of abnormal vibrations might have been an early sign of that sensor malfunction." Ebony swallowed hard. "So if they had listened, maybe run a manual diagnostic earlier, they could have mitigated the problem?" Alvarez nodded, regret lining his features. "Possibly. We can't say for sure, but your concerns were valid. The flight data recorder will tell us more." Despite the swirl of relief knowing she hadn't imagined anything, Ebony's heart sank. This entire ordeal might have been minimized if the flight crew had acknowledged her observations. She felt no joy in being right, only sorrow that people had to endure terror. Over the next several hours, Ebony was questioned by airline representatives, safety officials, and eventually the media, who sniffed out the angle. A black female engineer tried to warn the pilot, only to be brushed off. Ebony was cautious in what she said to reporters. She didn't want to sensationalize or stoke tension, but the story practically sold itself. Ebony's credentials were real, and the pilot's refusal to believe her might have placed hundreds of lives in jeopardy. The avalanche of consequences began almost immediately. That evening, Ebony saw a breaking news segment on a major network: "Hero engineer or overlooked passenger. Airline scrambles for answers after near crash in Denver." Her photograph, taken from her LinkedIn profile, flashed on screen. Ebony felt a lurch in her stomach. She never asked for this spotlight. And then came the rumor that Captain Parker had been put on immediate administrative leave pending the investigation. Ebony gleaned this from a Twitter post by an airline insider, then confirmed it through a hush-hush statement given to the press. Parker, it seemed, was about to face the music. The next day was a whirlwind of media requests. Ebony found herself in a hotel suite, courtesy of the airline, where she'd been asked to stay pending further interviews. She tried to decompress, nibbling on a room service sandwich and scrolling through her phone. Social media was ablaze with the story. Hashtags like hashtag listen to black women and hashtag engineer ignored soared in trending topics. People praised Ebony's expertise, outraged that her warning had been dismissed. Ebony felt overwhelmed. She had fought her whole life to be recognized for her talents, not her skin color. Yet here it was again, front and center in a national conversation. She debated refusing the media requests altogether, but she also recognized the moment's importance. It wasn't just about her. It was about every woman, every person of color, who'd been overlooked or dismissed, despite having valid expertise. Finally, Ebony decided she would do a short interview with a reputable news station, focusing on the facts rather than fueling drama. In that interview, Ebony spoke calmly about the timeline, her attempt to alert the cabin crew, and her brief encounter with Captain Parker. She emphasized the need for humility in the aviation industry, praising the co-pilot for quick thinking during the landing and acknowledging that flying remained extremely safe overall. She also delivered a pointed message. No matter someone's background or appearance, if they bring credible expertise to the table, especially in a potential emergency, listen first, judge later. The public response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from engineers across the globe, from STEM advocacy groups, and from ordinary passengers grateful she spoke up. Ebony's email overflowed with speaking invitations at women in engineering conferences, corporate diversity panels, and even an offer to collaborate on an aerospace documentary. Meanwhile, the airline faced a firestorm of criticism. Investigative pieces popped up, painting a picture of a pilot known for an abrasive attitude. Former colleagues anonymously described him as hard-headed, unwilling to consider outside opinions, and condescending. One headline read, "Pilot's arrogance nearly costs 180 lives." Ebony felt a wave of pity, even for a man who had dismissed her. She had no desire to see anyone's career destroyed, yet she also believed accountability mattered. If Parker had listened sooner, maybe they wouldn't have come so close to disaster. Within a week, the airline announced that Captain Leland Parker was suspended indefinitely, pending a detailed NTSB investigation. Rumors swirled that he might lose his pilot's license if the report concluded his actions were negligent. 10 days after the incident, Ebony was still in Denver, attending follow-up meetings with investigators. She had checked out of the airline-sponsored hotel, opting for a quieter location. One evening, as she walked through the near-deserted lobby, she heard her name called. She turned to see Captain Parker, standing by a row of chairs, looking worn and pale. Gone was the crisp uniform and polished posture. He wore a simple jacket, and his usually sharp gaze was dull with fatigue. "Miss King," he said hoarsely, "can we talk?" Ebony paused, every instinct telling her to keep it brief, but something about his disheveled appearance tugged at her sense of empathy. She nodded slowly. "All right." They sat in the dimly lit lounge area. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Parker cleared his throat. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry." The words seemed to cost him. His jaw clenched painfully. I never meant to put anyone in danger. The sensor data was conflicting, and I panicked." Ebony studied his face, seeing the torment etched there. "I understand mechanical failures happen. It's a tough job. But you dismissed me outright, Captain. You made an assumption about me because..." "What?" "I didn't look like a typical engineer," he flinched. "Maybe, probably. I've lived in this cockpit bubble for decades. I guess I didn't think a passenger could tell me something I didn't already know." He rubbed his temples. But I was wrong. A swirl of emotions filled Ebony: anger, sadness, pity. She remembered the terror she'd felt as the plane lurched, the screams of passengers. "You know, it's not just about me," she said quietly. "People get dismissed every day, in critical moments, because of bias. It's costly. This time it almost cost lives." Parker nodded, eyes shining with regret. "I won't try to excuse it. The NTSB investigation might strip me of my license. If they don't, I don't know if anyone will hire me again. My career is over, most likely." He paused, looking as if he wanted to say more, but couldn't find the words. Ebony stared at her folded hands. A big part of her was furious at him, but another part felt compassion for a man facing the downfall of everything he'd built. She remembered the countless times she'd been undermined, how that felt. "I'm sorry you're going through this," she said finally, "but it's also an opportunity for reflection, for you, for the airline, for the entire industry." He swallowed hard, nodding. "I know. I deserve what's coming, I guess. But I wanted to tell you in person, I'm sorry." Ebony stood, feeling the tension in her limbs. She looked down at the man who had once loomed so large and intimidating. Now he seemed small and vulnerable. "Thank you for saying that." Without another word, she left him there in the half-lit lounge, the echo of remorse clinging to the air. In the weeks that followed, the official NTSB report cited mechanical failure as the primary cause of the incident, but it also criticized the cockpit's poor coordination and response to early warning signs. Captain Parker was found to have disregarded a legitimate concern. The final recommendation didn't outright remove his license, but it heavily sanctioned him, requiring remedial training and psychological evaluation before he could ever pilot another commercial flight. The airline promptly terminated his contract, effectively barring him from returning under their banner. Ebony became something of a reluctant celebrity in aerospace circles. Engineers commended her for her professionalism and for shining a light on the importance of listening to qualified voices, no matter their seat on the plane. She returned to her regular work, consulting on propulsion systems, but with a new wave of opportunities knocking at her door. In a statement that went viral, Ebony said, "Let this be a reminder that expertise can come from unexpected places, and that ignoring potential warnings, no matter who delivers them, can lead to catastrophe. In critical moments, humility can save lives." Meanwhile, Ebony's life took a pleasantly surprising turn. Companies that once hesitated to hire her at certain pay grades were now clamoring for her input on advanced aerospace designs. She was asked to mentor young engineers from underrepresented backgrounds, something she embraced wholeheartedly. For Ebony, true success meant paving the way for others to be heard, to innovate, to excel without the burden of prejudice. One day, Ebony received a letter, an old school paper letter, delivered to her office. It had no return address. Inside, she found a single page with a short, handwritten note. "Miss King, I'm enrolled in a leadership course focusing on inclusive decision-making, sponsored by the airline industry. I just wanted you to know I'm taking steps to ensure I never repeat my mistakes. Thank you for the wake-up call." LPEBONY stared at the note for a long time. She folded it gently, placed it in a drawer, and returned to her design schematics. The sensation was bittersweet, a reminder that sometimes the greatest lessons come at a steep price. Yet if even one person changed, it was worth it. Months had passed since the emergency landing at Denver International Airport, but the memory of Flight 572 still lingered in Ebony King's mind like an indelible watermark. Though she'd never asked to become a public figure, the incident catapulted her into a spotlight that shone on bias, negligence, and the power of genuine expertise, even when that expertise came from a surprising source. At first, The attention was overwhelming. Her inbox brimmed with messages from fellow engineers, journalists, advocacy groups, and even curious strangers. Some wrote to congratulate her on standing firm in her knowledge. Others admitted her story had opened their eyes to their own unconscious biases at work or in daily life. Ebony tried to respond personally to as many as she could, at least with a note of thanks. But the sheer volume made it impossible to keep up. She was often torn between gratitude and exhaustion, grateful that people cared, exhausted by the unrelenting need to defend, explain, or rehash the harrowing experience of that flight. Still, Ebony remained grounded. Every day she found solace in returning to her core passion, designing, testing, and refining propulsion systems that could one day make air travel even safer and more efficient. She'd accepted a new consulting contract with an innovative aerospace startup, Novalift Technologies, which specialized in hybrid electric engines. The work was exhilarating, a chance to push boundaries and make commercial aviation more eco-friendly. And yet, every so often, Ebony would pause over a set of schematics and recall the abrupt tremor in flight 572-572's right engine. She still felt a pang of what-ifs. What if the pilot had listened sooner? What if she had been more forceful in conveying her concerns? Even though the outcome was not her fault and ended in one piece on the runway, she couldn't quite banish those lingering questions from her mind. Her life also changed in other subtle ways. Where before she traveled incognito, blending into the background at conferences, Ebony now found her name on keynote speaker lists and specialized panels. She lost count of the times she was introduced as the hero engineer who tried to warn the pilot. Some sessions focused on flight safety, others on workplace diversity, and a growing number on leadership and bias in high-stakes environments. Ebony had always been confident in her area of expertise, but speaking publicly about social issues or about her identity as a black woman in STEM was new territory. Yet each time she told her story, she saw how it resonated with others who had felt dismissed or unheard. The numerous messages she received afterward, especially from young women of color, reinforced her determination to advocate for inclusive policies across the aviation industry. One spring afternoon, Ebony was invited to speak at a NASA-sponsored symposium on advanced propulsion. It was a dream come true in a way. She'd once interned there, starry-eyed at the thought of contributing to space exploration. Now she walked through NASA's gleaming corridors as a respected aerospace engineer with her own set of battle scars from the commercial aviation world. The day was filled with back-to-back presentations on emerging propulsion technologies, hypersonic flight, and the next generation of sustainable jet fuels. Ebony listened as experts with decades of experience laid out their visions for the future. When it was her turn to take the podium, she felt a surge of pride mingled with the familiar knot of stage fright. The auditorium was packed with scientists, engineers, and NASA administrators. She began by explaining the complexity of sensor systems in modern aircraft, using a simplified diagram of the Boeing 737 sensor suite as an example. In a clear, measured tone, she described how a single misreading or a delayed response to an anomaly could escalate exponentially. Her talk, however, was about more than technology. It was about the human factor, how trusting or distrusting a colleague's expertise, or even a passenger's observations, might define the margin between safe landings and near disasters. "We design fail-safes into our hardware," Ebony said, her voice echoing across the rows of rapt faces. "But we also need fail-safes against our own biases. When it comes to aviation, we can't afford arrogance." A thunderous applause followed her final words, and for the first time that day, Ebony allowed herself a small, grateful smile. Throughout these public events, Ebony couldn't help but notice a shift in how people viewed her. Before, they would regard her as just another face in the crowd, quiet, maybe a bit too youthful looking to be a seasoned engineer. Now, she was greeted with respect, sometimes even awe. She knew the difference came not just from her professional credentials, but from the story of Flight 572. In many ways, that story had become a catalyst for broader discussions about credibility and diversity across STEM fields. Beyond the conference circuit, Ebony's everyday life also began to reflect the ripple effects of her public stance. She was approached by schools to mentor budding engineers, often bright-eyed girls who felt isolated in male-dominated robotics clubs or STEM electives. Ebony took those requests seriously, carving out time each week to connect through Zoom sessions or in-person workshops whenever possible. She saw her younger self in their eyes, hungry for knowledge, brimming with ambition, yet occasionally questioning if they truly belonged. Sharing her personal journey, including the challenges, became a source of mutual inspiration. Meanwhile, media outlets kept the story alive in their own way, particularly once the National Transportation Safety Board (NTSB) released its official, final findings. The mechanical issues that had plagued Flight 572 were indeed serious, but they noted that the pilot's hesitation to trust early warnings, whether from the flight instruments or from Ebony's observations, contributed to the dangerous descent. While Ebony's name didn't appear as an official hero in the report, the subtext was clear. Cockpit leadership had failed in its duty to remain open to potential red flags, no matter the source. Amid all of these discussions, Captain Leland Parker's fate hung quietly in the background. The airline had let him go, and the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) strongly recommended remedial training if he ever wanted to fly commercially again. Ebony didn't keep tabs on Parker. She wanted to move on without replaying his condescension in her mind. But the public's curiosity about him persisted, and rumors circulated that he'd retreated from the public eye entirely. Some believed he might emerge one day, rebranded and rehabilitated after acknowledging his mistakes. Others said he was too proud for that kind of introspection. Then, one day, Ebony returned to her office to find a surprising letter resting on her desk. There was no name on the envelope, and the only clue to its source was an airline's generic return address. Opening it, she found a typed message. "Miss King, I attended a leadership course sponsored by the airline industry. My pride took a big hit, and I've had to come to terms with the mistakes that nearly cost us Flight 572. I realized too late that I'd let my own biases blind me to a credible warning. The crash that nearly happened has lived in my nightmares ever since. Please know I regret my role in disregarding your insight that day. I've chosen to step away from commercial flying for now, but I'm hoping to make amends by sharing my story. The training program wants me to speak about pilot humility and trust. Maybe there's still a place for me in aviation, even if it's not in the cockpit. Thank you for the wake-up call." L. Parker. Ebony read the letter twice, absorbing each line. Emotions tumbled through her: relief, vindication, but also a quiet sadness for the man who had spent his life flying skies only to fall from grace in such a public way. She tucked the letter carefully into her desk drawer, next to the earlier handwritten note he'd sent from Denver. He had reached out again, and this time the tone felt raw, tinged with regret and a wish for redemption. That same evening, Ebony had dinner with Daniel, her seatmate from Flight 572. They'd kept in touch via occasional emails, marveling at how life had changed since they were thrown together in a moment of crisis. Over plates of steaming pasta, Daniel asked if she'd heard anything new about Parker. Ebony hesitated, but decided to share the gist of the letter. Daniel gave a thoughtful nod. "Sometimes the hardest thing is admitting we were wrong. Maybe he'll find a way to turn this around and do some good, help other pilots avoid that same pitfall." Ebony sipped her wine, considering Daniel's words. I hope so. If he can channel his experience into saving lives, into reminding other pilots to stay open-minded, then maybe that near disaster won't have been in vain. They spent the rest of the evening talking about simpler things, Daniel's new real estate ventures, Ebony's upcoming project with Novalift, plans to travel together in the future this time. They joked on a plane that Ebony herself had inspected. The conversation brought laughter and reminded both of them that, while the dark memory of Flight 572 would never fully vanish, life continued in hopeful, sometimes even joyful ways. Not long after, Ebony was invited to deliver a special presentation at Boeing's headquarters in Renton, near Seattle. She had presented there before in small technical panels, but this was a larger forum. Executives, engineers, and line workers would all attend. The theme, collaboration and innovation in the evolving aerospace industry. Ebony prepared meticulously, knowing she wanted to bridge the gap between the lofty realm of design and the day-to-day realities of maintenance, inspections, and pilot operations. When the day arrived, she stood on a broad stage in a large auditorium, backlit by a huge monitor displaying her slides. Rows of employees filled the seats, from high-ranking aerospace executives to mechanics in grease-stained uniforms. Some might have expected a dense technical lecture on advanced propulsion systems, her usual domain. Instead, Ebony opened with a personal anecdote about the vibrations she'd felt on Flight 572, the immediate recognition of something amiss, and the fateful conversation with Captain Parker. She detailed the chain reaction of missteps that followed, the sensor misread, the confusion in the cockpit, the near crash. Then she pivoted to her central point. Even the most advanced technologies can't compensate for human factors when we refuse to listen to each other. Real innovation requires collaboration, and that means respecting expertise, no matter who's speaking. A hush fell over the room when she finished. It wasn't the kind of hush that signaled boredom or disinterest, but rather a collective sense of understanding and responsibility. As the applause built, Ebony saw heads nodding in agreement. These were the people who designed and built the aircraft themselves, who tested wings and engines in wind tunnels, who debugged sensor systems on assembly lines. Hearing from someone who had survived a near disaster, grounded in the misalignment between technology and human attitude, left a profound impression. In the aftermath of that talk, Boeing's head of engineering personally thanked Ebony, promising to implement new training modules that emphasized the human dimension of safety checks and decision-making. We spend billions on research to make planes safer, he said, but stories like yours remind us that the people involved, the pilot, the engineer, even the passenger matter just as much as the hardware. That evening, back in her hotel room, Ebony felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The swirl of media coverage and corporate interest was no longer unnerving. She realized she'd found a clear purpose that combined her technical genius with her hard-won perspective on bias. She had become a catalyst for dialogue, for ensuring that the next Ebony King, wherever she might be, however she might look, would be heeded when she spoke about anomalies in an airplane's performance or pitched a new design that seemed revolutionary. Of course, Ebony never forgot the real human cost behind her newfound influence. Over time, she'd seen how some people tried to frame her story as a neat, fable engineer versus arrogant pilot, without appreciating the raw fear that had gripped every soul on Flight 572. Still, she cherished the final outcome. Everyone had walked off that plane alive. The spectre of tragedy now served as a guiding light for reforms throughout the aviation world. On quiet nights, when she replayed those moments in her mind, the gut churning vibration, the pilot's dismissive glare, the thunderous emergency landing. Ebony would also recall the exhausted, shaken faces of the crew who guided passengers onto the runway. She remembered children clinging to parents, tears of relief, and passengers offering one another hugs. That sense of collective survival inspired her to keep pushing forward. Flight 572 had challenged Ebony's identity, tested her resilience, and made her a spokesperson for something bigger than her own career. But she realized she was ready for it. Every technical paper she wrote, every design she improved, and every public talk she delivered wove back into the same mission: to make the skies safer, to bring more voices into the fold, and to ensure that no crucial piece of knowledge would ever again be ignored. And so, as Ebony King looked out the window of her new office at Novalift Technologies, where engineers of all backgrounds worked side by side, she felt a surge of determination. She reflected on a simple truth: planes are machines built by human hands, flown by human pilots, and carrying human passengers. If we refuse to honor one another's expertise, we risk everything. But if we learn to trust, to collaborate, and to remain humble in the face of complexity, we can soar to new heights together. She had lived through the storm, saved lives with her warnings, and emerged with a clarion call for empathy and open-mindedness in the modern aerospace world. That, she decided, was the final lesson she wanted to share. And it was a lesson that would resonate well beyond the confines of flight decks, echoing into every sphere where a keen eye, a vital piece of knowledge, and a single voice could avert catastrophe. Thank you for joining me on this intense journey of Flight 572, a story of crisis, resilience, and the triumph of knowledge over bias. We saw how Ebony King's unwavering dedication to her craft saved countless lives, even when disbelief stood in her way. And we witnessed the steep price of arrogance as Captain Leland Parker faced the fallout of ignoring expertise that came from an unexpected source. Stories like these remind us that everyone has something valuable to contribute. Trust can mean the difference between calamity and a safe landing. If you were moved by Ebony's courage, please consider sharing this video. Let's inspire others with her lesson. Expertise transcends stereotypes, and humility is vital in high-stakes situations. So hit that like button, share with your community, and subscribe for more stories of triumph against the odds. Let's keep learning and elevating each other together.